Hi and welcome to the Odometer Quick Start Guide. In this video we'll cover the very basics of the plugin as well as counting with numbers. Check out the other tutorials for counting with words or glyphs. This is what your download should look like. If you need any assistance with the installation, double click on this link and it will direct you to our written guide which has a lot of detail about all the different things you might need. So with that out of the way, let's get started. We'll just add odometer to a solid. At the top here we'll see we have an odometer warning, no texture has been supplied. We need to click create to make a texture. Now we only need to do this once at the very start. It's important to note that it doesn't matter which settings you have here in the character panel. Odometer is going to clear those settings just to make sure that it creates the texture correctly, because things such as scale and whatnot could stuff that up. If we double click on the texture, we can see we have numbers, currencies, uppercase, lowercase, and then symbols. We also have transparency. The plugin will render that by default, but you could also put in a bitmap texture as a custom background. I'm going to come in here and change the font because it's going to default that to Arial. So I'm going to set that to San Francisco. If you see a symbol that you might need that's currently missing, that's okay, you can just replace it. For example, if I didn't want to count in dollars, I wanted to count in magic internet money, I could double click here and just insert the Dogecoin sign, and then we'd be counting in Dogecoin instead of dollars. Now let's go back to the main comp. Odometer setup. And let's jump into the numbers here. I want to count from 0 to 1,000. And currently we don't have enough integer columns to show that. So now we have 0 to 1,000. And just for demonstration's sake, I'm going to add in a decimal there. The custom symbol, what are we counting in? Well, I want to count in dollars, but as I said, if you wanted to, you could change this symbol. I'll just make it red just to show what's going on here. You could change that to a Bitcoin symbol and then you'd have the Bitcoin symbol. Separators, all these characters are the same width. Come here to layout, we can see if we increase the tracking there, they're all the exact same width, which you may or may not want. At its default, it's all kind of acting like everything's monospaced, but if you want, you can give the separators a little less space. If you go too low, you'll see they're getting cut off here, but they really don't need that much space. And actually, I'm going to go to the background fill and change that to 0. If you remember, we actually have transparency in here, but the plugin will add some background fill at 50% by default just to help you visualize the layout of what's going on. So I'm going to lower the tracking and also remove the background opacity. Now, if I want to make this larger, what I can do here, come to the uniform scale, but that's capped at 100. So if you want to render larger, you should scale the texture up by double, and then you can fine tune the scale. You can't go above 100% here, otherwise the texture that you've supplied would get pixelated, but you can fine tune it less than 100%. Now we'll move the object into the center of the screen and just preview this animation. It's looking very boring. So what we can do here is come in and add some easing. I'm going to add Ease and Whiz Expo. And if we turn on motion blur here, we'll want to have motion blur turned on in the composition and on the layer itself. It's adding easing, but if we preview it, we'll see that it's not really enough. At the end, the velocity is still so high that there's a bunch of motion blur. So I'm just going to quickly come in here. This is an Ease and Whiz specific thing, but I'm going to change the power to 20 and 20, and that will give us a much smoother animation. To make it more interesting, we can also come into the modifiers here and add a stagger. So if I removed disabled this easing expression, if we have no stagger, everything basically starts moving at the same time. But a stagger per column will add, for the rightmost column, we'll start counting first, and then it will wait 3 frames for each additional column to start counting. And I forgot to mention, you don't need to add easing expressions. You could also just come in here and change the Bezier curves to add your own easing, but I find Ease and Whiz gives really good flexibility with these granular expressions. So let's preview what the animation looks like. That's looking pretty good. Something else we can play with here is the height. So currently 100%, let's just turn on our thing here, and actually to visualize this better, I'm going to make the grid guide in our texture actually not a guide layer, and you can see that we're rendering at 100% height is just one cell, but if we wanted to, we could actually render more cells. So I'm going to render 2 extra cells high, and then I'm going to make that back to a guide layer because it's a bit distracting, and then I'll turn down the transparency of the opacity, and then I'm going to introduce some perspective. This is really cool. It's going to give us the impression that it's on a 3D wheel. And then we can see that we're getting a hard cutoff here. So we have feather if you want to introduce some feathering there. You can also visualize the feather map if you want, just to see what that exactly is doing, because you can actually crank this above 100. But you'll see at 0 feathering, there's just a hard line, and then at 100%, there's a smooth gradient between the very middle and the ends, and then 200%, it just feathers it a bit more. So let's stop visualizing that. I'm going to just set it to 100%, and let's see what this looks like. Looking good. Last tab here we have is rendering and quality. So motion blur, you can fine tune the exact amount of motion blur that you want, the amount of samples. If you're counting a really large number, this won't be enough, but you can crank this right up. It still renders really quick. Relatively quick. You can also silence the warnings. So for example, one of the warnings that we got was if we don't have a texture. These are meant to be helpful, but you know, sometimes they can be a little annoying, so you could silence them, but I would recommend you leave them on until you're very comfortable with what you're doing, because there's a bunch of different warnings you could get. And that's about it. That was the introduction to the numbers mode. Check out the other text and glyph modes where you can count words and symbols as well. Otherwise, that's it for this tutorial, and I hope you enjoy using the product. Hi, and welcome to the second Odometer tutorial video. In the previous video, we did a quick overview of the entire plugin, as well as counting numbers. In this video, we're going to be counting text. So when we go to the text mode, instead of a number slider, we now get these two default layer marker comments. And these are essentially our keyframes. If we toggle between them, we can see that we are indeed animating between the two. If we double click here, we can change the comment. And the reason that we use layer markers is just because it's convenient that we can visually identify which string each marker contains. I'm going to change this to hello, and then I'm going to change this one to world. And we would need 6 columns for that. So change that to 6. You can see that the full stop did not show up. Let's come into included characters, and we can see that we are using uppercase and lowercase. If we go into our Odometer texture, it's the same texture as we used for the previous video, because that texture contains everything that we could possibly need. The reason that we're getting a space here is very important. If you request Odometer to display a character that either isn't in the included characters here or doesn't exist in your texture, it will just default to a blank space. So if you ever see a blank space where it shouldn't be, double check that the character that you've inputted is correct and that you also have it. Now, if we preview this animation, we can see that we cycle through a bunch of uppercase characters, and then we also have lowercase characters. If we preview the texture here, we can see we have all the characters from A to Z in uppercase, and then we have them in lowercase. Now that's important for 2 reasons. One is that this is a giant texture that needs to be generated by the plugin, so it slows performance. 2 is that now we're getting lowercase characters, which I don't actually want. So I'm going to remove lowercase from here, and I could add in symbols now, and I would see that my full stop appears. The problem with symbols is that there are a lot of them, and if we were to say randomize this texture, we'd get a lot of symbols appearing. So instead of that, what I'm going to do instead is take away symbols, but I'm going to replace a letter that we're not using. So Q is a very uncommon character, so I'm going to replace that with a dot. And in here, instead of world dot, I'm going to replace it with world Q, and we can see that we get the dot there. And we need to do that here as well. It's going to go hello world. Another thing is that we can see that currently these columns are in order, J, K, L, M, N. That's fine, but I want to introduce some randomness to the results. So I'm going to click randomize positions here. We're getting a lot of spaces just by chance, so I'm going to change the random seed to remove that. And now we can see that we have randomness, but if we have 2 characters that are the same, the randomness is the same for each. If we have randomized positions ticked, we can also come down to randomize each column, and that's going to use a different seed for each column. Now I might change the seed again. Another thing is that because the 4th column is the same between both markers, the 4th column just simply doesn't move because it's taking the shortest path. That's the way that Odometer works. It will take the shortest path from A to B, and we can customize that behavior by coming into animation here, and we can choose this option here, force minimum spins. If we tick that, now the 4th column is forced to spin, and the amount of times that it will spin is based on this minimum spin. So it's going to spin at least 2 times. If this minimum spins was lowered to say 1, we could see that some columns are traveling at different speeds to other columns, and we may or may not want that. I don't really like that. I like it when it looks like all columns are traveling at about the same speed. So the larger this minimum spins is, the more uniform the velocity of the columns will be. Another thing to mention is that because we're using layer markers instead of keyframes, these don't have velocity or Bezier curves that we can customize the easing with. So for that reason, we have an easing tab and we have all the penna easing modes here. In the previous video, we're using the number slider and we added the exponential easing to that. Well, pow is similar to that, except we now have this pow factor, and this is really useful. Just say we had our minimum spin set to something quite high, and this pow factor was only at say 10, we can see that on the very first frame, the speed ramps up very quickly. So what we can do is just increase this pow factor, and now we'll get this very beautiful gradual ease. The more minimum spins you have, or just say you're counting numbers and you're counting from 0 to 1 trillion, this pow factor will become very, very important. Otherwise you won't be able to get a smooth ramp up of motion. It will just be very jarring. We also have some creative easing modes, such as bounce, back, and elastic. And these are custom parameters unique to those modes. Up here we have two convenience buttons just for working with these layer markers. We can click add text key to add a new layer marker, or if we click duplicate key, this will duplicate the nearest key. So for example, I've clicked it here, so world is the nearest. And let's just say we want to make this animation looping. So we want to loop back to this one at the start. Let's preview this. That looks good. We go from hello to world, and then we hold on world, and then it transitions back to hello. Now the reason that it holds between these keyframes is that ignore identical keys is checked. If this was unchecked, then even though these are the same word, they will still animate between each other. So this allows you a very fine amount of control as to whether you want to ignore identical keys or not. That's about it for the text mode. In the next video, we'll look at the glyphs mode, which is great for animating symbols. Hi and welcome to the third video in the Odometer tutorial series. In this video, we're looking at animating with glyphs. In the previous video, we looked at animating text. Now the difference between glyphs and text is that with glyphs, we actually use a different kind of texture. Whereas the numbers and text modes both share the same type of texture, glyphs is unique. With glyphs, what we do is we specify the number of glyphs that we want first, and then when we hit create, based on the number of glyphs total, a different texture is generated. So for example, I said I wanted a glyph with 6 elements, and here we have a glyph texture with 6 elements. Now I've done a little bit of preparation, so instead of using that one, I'm going to switch to my odometer texture glyph. And if we double click on that, we can see we have some slot machine icons, and I've just put a guide layer on top of those so that we know what's what. So that we can see exactly what's going on, I'm just going to come in and lock this composition and open up the odometer composition. And I can see that a 0 represents a spade. Now I want this to start off with the 4 suits of the card, so 0, 1, 2, 3 on the first marker. And then I want it to animate to 4 crowns, which is 4, 4, 4, 4. And we can see the animation that we have animates to 4 crowns. Let's do a little bit of layout. I'll put this more in the middle. I want to be able to see 3 rows high, so I'll change the height to 300. And let's play around with the randomized positions so that we don't have much variety. I still want it to look a little random. Okay, that will do. Something that I'd like to do is add some more spacing between each of these elements. So if we come into the texture glyph, what we can do is just, if we make sure that we have all these anchor points centered, you can scale these down so that there's more space in between everything. And that looks a lot better. So you can customize space that way. You also have the tracking to customize the X spacing individually. And now I'd also like some perspective to make it look like it's spinning on a wheel. And it arrives at its final destination way too quick. So we'll come down to animation and we'll set a force minimum spins to at least 6. So that's a bit more like slot machines. And we can retime the animation here, make it last 3 seconds. And I'll add a stagger frames per column of 1.5. That's looking very slot machine-esque. Let's just say that we're happy with this, but the client comes back and says, yep, that's good, but we've added an extra character into our slot machine. Can you add it in? Well, to do that, what we want to do is tell the plugin that there's going to be a total of 7 glyphs now. The result will look very strange. That's normal because we haven't modified the texture itself. Then we come into the texture and we go to the comp settings. Each element represents 200 by 200. So if we wanted to add a 7th, this would need to be 1400 high. Now we'd also need to move these elements up. Actually, you really don't want to be moving the grid. That's generally why it's locked. And then let's come in and add in a 6th element. And instead of a cherry, I'm just gonna add in a grape. And just so we know which character that is, I'll change that to a 6. And then we come back. If we want to make the textures larger, we can always use the texture scale up or down buttons within the plugin, and then fine tune that with the uniform scale. And now we have 7 characters total. So that's how to retroactively change the number of glyphs that you have, and that about wraps it up for this tutorial. In the next video, we'll cover troubleshooting and the general warnings inside Odometer. Hi and welcome to the Odometer Troubleshooting and Warnings Guide. This video is about all the different warnings that you might get pop up during your use of Odometer. And the purpose of warnings are that they mean to alert you about any possible circumstances that might cause the output of the plugin to be different to what you expect. So for example, the most obvious warning is that we don't have a texture supplied and we need to hit create. So let's go and do that. Pretty simple. Okay, now let's go into text mode here, and we can see that by default included characters are uppercase and lowercase, which we have some here, Odo, Annie. The included characters options tells the plugin which categories of characters we want to include. If we had no lowercase characters, for example, we only want uppercase. Remember that Odometer won't warn you if you have characters included in your layer marker comments that aren't checked here. It will just render a space instead. Now, if we had no included characters checked, it can't display any of these, so it pops a warning. Under the rendering and quality tab, we can change the size of this warning, or we could silence it altogether, but I would recommend not silencing it unless you know exactly what you're doing. Another issue might be if we had no markers at all. Even if we had all of these checked, the plugin wouldn't know what to render. So no keyframe markers supplied, nothing will be rendered. And under animation, click add text key to add something. And the text key, if you have no keys at all, will add 2 by default so that you can animate between them. And then it will just add another one. Now, what happens if we have all these ticked and we want to make the texture larger? We're getting an error here saying that the texture that we want to generate, that includes all of these, would be 200 by 20K, and the graphics card limit on this computer is 16K. Instead, we can resize that down, and we don't need to scale it by half or double all the time. We can go into the Odometer texture itself, and if we needed extra resolution, we would come to File, Scripts, Scale Composition. This comes with After Effects, and I'm going to set a size factor of 1.6. Now we can include every single one of these characters that we want and increase the resolution. If we wanted even more resolution, we would get, sorry, too big. We could have to uncheck some of these. So now I can render it really large, but you will only get the option of 26 characters. Another warning we may get is, let's say we want to render this really high, so lots and lots of rows, and I also want to introduce some perspective. We get a warning, the texture height of 764 is taller than the layer height of 720. Now the texture height here is referring to how tall we requested it. This warning only pops up if perspective is on. So it says portions may be cut off because perspective is on. We can increase the composition height to resolve. If we had no perspective, we'd have no issue. There's nothing being cut off. But because we have perspective on and it's a post effect, we need the entire result to be visible without anything getting cut off. So let's just come in here and increase the height of the comp to 1000 and then increase the height of the layer to 1000. And we'd see now none of the texture is getting cut off. And so if we increase the perspective, there would be no issues. There is, however, one more thing to be aware of. If we have the layout in the middle of the composition, nothing will be cut off. But if we moved it up to the top left, we can see that we are still getting cut off. And we're not getting a warning about that because theoretically this layer is big enough, but because it's not centered, then we will still get something cut off. So if we move that back to the center, there won't be any issues. And of course, if you wanted to, instead of having a hard cutoff, we could add a soft feather there. Another issue we could have is if the odometer texture was somehow turned to continuously rasterize, and we'll get a warning about that. The texture layer is set to continuous rasterization, uncheck it for correct behavior, and that's because now that continuous rasterization is checked, the layer that we are sourcing here has its transformations applied beforehand. So for example, I can now move this odometer texture and it will be reflected. And of course we can see things going wrong there. The reason that this is a problem is because this, but also if we scale this down to 0, technically this layer is so small that it doesn't exist, and then the plugin's saying, oh, we don't actually have a texture supplied. So it's actually giving us the wrong warning. So that is the reason that you do not want the texture to have continuous rasterization. The idea is that the odometer texture layer visibility is turned off and we don't have to worry about it. We could even set it to be a shy layer and then not have to think about it. Now let's just say we wanted to come up and create a odometer texture, but that button wasn't working for us. But we actually have a backup just in case. So just say clicking create doesn't work for you for whatever reason, you can just import the texture setup here, and then we have the default texture as a composition and the glyph as well. Also in the download we have a link to the written documentation. If we come back into the plugin under about and support, click on get support, it will open that same link, which will bring you to our Notion page, and that has a bunch of frequently asked questions, as well as how you can get in contact if you have a bug or some issue that we haven't mentioned, or you just run into trouble. The best way to get in contact is via the aescripts ticket system, and we have a link for that there. So those are all the issues that we anticipate people having when using Odometer, but of course unforeseen circumstances always arise. So if you do have an issue, go through this avenue and we'll do our best to sort you out as soon as possible.